He was a cold, wealthy Korean man who trusted no one, until a bold Nigerian maid walked into his mansion with nothing but her faith, her fire, and her food. What started as rejection turned into redemption, and slowly, love found its way through the cracks of his guarded heart. This isn't just a story about culture or class. It's about healing, faith, and the kind of love that changes everything. Sit back, take a deep breath, and let this story carry you. It was a cold morning in Seoul. The big white house on the hill stood still and quiet. Inside the house lived June, a rich young man. He was only 27 years old, but already very powerful. Everyone in the house was afraid of him. He didn't smile. He didn't say thank you, and he was very, very picky about food. June had many maids before, Korean maids, good ones. But he fired all of them. If one dropped a spoon, gone. If the rice was too soft, fire. No one lasted more than 2 weeks. Today, a new maid came. Her name was Christabel. She was from Nigeria. She wore a long dress and had a calm smile on her face. Her skin was dark and shiny, and her eyes were bright like stars. She held a small Bible in her bag. The house manager frowned. "Are you sure you want to work here?" he asked. Christabel smiled. "Yes, sir. I believe God brought me here." The manager shook his head. "We'll see how long you last." When June saw her, he frowned deeply. "Who is this?" "Sir," Christabel said with a small bow. "I'm Christabel. I came to work." "You can go," June said coldly. "I don't want a new maid." But Christabel stood tall. "Sir, please, give me one day. Taste my food. If you don't like it, I will leave." June's eyes narrowed. No one had spoken to him like that before. Not rude, but not scared. Bold, but gentle. He turned away. "Fine. One day." In the kitchen, Christabel sang softly as she cooked. She made jollof rice, spicy and red, with grilled chicken. The smell filled the house. The workers peeked into the kitchen. No one had cooked like that before. June sat at the table, arms crossed. When the plate was placed before him, he looked at it for a long time. Then he took a bite. His eyes widened. He chewed slowly, then faster. He didn't speak, but he didn't stop eating. Plate empty. Heart confused. He looked up. Christabel stood by the door, her hands folded. Something inside him moved. He didn't know what. But he said the words anyway. "You can stay." The next morning, June woke up early. He didn't know why. The sun was just rising, and the air was still cool. He usually stayed in bed until 10 a.m., but today felt different. He walked down to the kitchen quietly. He didn't want anyone to see him. That felt strange too. He never cared who saw him before. Christabel was already in the kitchen. She had tied her hair up with a bright green scarf and was kneeling beside the stove, praying in a low voice. June stood there, watching her. Her eyes were closed. Her lips moved slowly. She didn't see him. She looked peaceful. He didn't understand why it made his chest feel warm. When she stood up and opened her eyes, she jumped a little. "Oh, good morning, sir." "Why were you on the floor?" he asked, his voice still cold. "I was praying. I always talk to God before I start the day." June scoffed. "And does he talk back?" She didn't get angry. She smiled gently. "Yes, but not the way you think. He speaks to my heart." June blinked. No one ever answered him like that. Usually, people stayed quiet when he mocked them. She turned back to the pot and stirred softly. "Would you like breakfast, sir?" "I don't eat breakfast," he said. "I made something light. Just taste it. You can stop if you hate it." He wanted to say no, but something about her made him nod. She served him a kara, round fried bean cakes, and pap, a smooth, warm drink. He tasted it. It was soft, golden, and just the right kind of spicy. The pap was sweet and smooth. He didn't say anything, but he finished the whole plate. Christabel smiled. "Thank you, sir." He looked at her again. "Stop calling me sir. My name is June." Her smile widened. "Okay. June." He turned quickly and walked out. But as he climbed the stairs, he caught himself smiling. He stopped. "Why am I smiling?" he whispered. He shook his head. "She's just a maid." But his heart didn't listen. That night, he had a dream. In it, Christabel stood in the middle of his garden, dressed in white, holding her Bible. Light surrounded her. She looked at him and said, "God doesn't make mistakes." He woke up sweating. He sat up in bed, breathing fast. He didn't believe in God, but why did her words sound true? The next few days felt like magic in the house. His workers noticed first. The lights in the mansion seemed brighter. The air felt lighter. And for the first time in a long time, June smiled. He didn't smile all the time, but once or twice, someone saw the corners of his lips turn up. That was enough to cause whispers in the kitchen. "It must be the new maid," one cleaner said. "It's her food," another whispered. But it wasn't just her cooking. It was her presence. Christabel didn't rush. She didn't panic. She moved with peace. She greeted everyone with kindness, even the ones who looked down on her. June started watching her. He would sit in the living room and pretend to read, just to hear her humming in the kitchen. He noticed how she helped the older gardener carry his tools, how she spoke gently to the house cat, who used to bite everyone, how she prayed quietly before every meal. One evening, after dinner, June sat on the balcony. He watched the stars above Seoul's hills. Christabel came out to pick up dried clothes from the line. He cleared his throat. She turned. "Yes. June?" He looked away. What? What are you always praying about?" She smiled and walked slowly toward him. "Sometimes I thank God. Sometimes I ask him to bless the house. Sometimes I pray for you." "For me?" he said, his eyes narrowing. "Yes," she said calmly. He leaned forward. "Why?" "Because you look like someone who's been hurt," she said, not unkindly. His chest tightened. For a second, he wanted to shout at her, but her voice was too soft, too honest. "I don't believe in God," he said sharply. She nodded. "That's okay. He believes in you." He stared at her. She picked up the basket of clothes and began to walk inside. Before she entered, she turned slightly. "And June," she said gently, "don't let pain make you cold forever." Then she was gone. June sat still for a long time. The stars above him seemed to blink kindly. That night, he didn't sleep much. He kept hearing her words. "Don't let pain make you cold forever." How did she know? He got out of bed and walked down to his study. He opened an old drawer and took out a photo. It was of his mother. She had died when he was just 15. She used to pray too. She used to call him my little star. He stared at the photo until tears filled his eyes. He hadn't cried in years, but tonight, he did. The next morning, Christabel found a small white envelope on the kitchen counter. It had her name written in neat handwriting. Christabel. She opened it slowly. Inside was a note. "Thank you for your prayers. June." Her hands shook a little. She wasn't expecting that. Not from him. She folded the note and placed it gently inside her Bible. From that day, something changed between them. June didn't speak much, but his voice was softer when he did. He no longer barked orders. He asked, kindly. He no longer ate alone. He began to take his meals in the dining room again, and he always finished every plate Christabel made. One day, she made a goosey soup with pounded yam. He looked at the thick yellow soup, unsure. "This is Nigerian food," she explained. He took a spoonful, chewed carefully, and nodded. "It's good." Christabel smiled. "It's made with melon seeds and love." He smiled faintly. "Maybe it's the love that tastes better." One evening, the power went out in the house. The lights flickered and died. A soft rain tapped on the windows. Most of the staff went to their rooms, waiting for the light to return. June lit a candle and walked downstairs. In the kitchen, he saw a soft glow. Christabel was sitting on the floor, a candle by her side, singing in a low, sweet voice. He stood at the door and listened. The song was in Yoruba, but the warmth in it touched his heart. When she saw him, she stopped. "Oh, sorry, did I disturb you?" "No," he said. "Your voice is peaceful." She laughed softly. "It's a song to thank God for the rain." He looked at her, curious. "Why thank God for rain?" "Because without it, the seeds can't grow." He sat on the other side of the kitchen. "Even when it brings darkness?" "Even then," she said. "The darkness won't last. It helps us see the light better." He was quiet. Then, after a moment, he said something that surprised them both. "I used to believe in light too," he whispered. She didn't ask questions. She just placed her candle near him and said, "Then maybe it's still inside you, just waiting." That night, June sat on the kitchen floor long after she left, holding her candle, watching it flicker, hoping it would never go out. A week passed, and something strange was happening in June's heart. He looked forward to mornings now. He walked into the kitchen early, hoping to hear Christabel's soft voice humming or praying. He watched her laugh with the other staff, and noticed how even the grumpiest gardener smiled more since she came. One afternoon, his friend Minho came to visit. Minho was loud and playful, the opposite of June. He walked into the mansion, stretched his arms wide and said, "Wow, your house finally feels alive." June shrugged. "It's just quieter now." Minho grinned. "No, it's warmer, like someone sprinkled joy in the air." That evening, Minho stayed for dinner. Christabel made suya, spicy grilled meat, and some kimchi on the side to make Joan feel at home. Minho took one bite and jumped up. This is fire. Who made this?" Christabel stepped out of the kitchen and bowed slightly. "Good evening, sir." Minho blinked. "You made this. You're amazing." June felt something sharp in his chest. He didn't like the way Minho was looking at her. Later that night, as Minho was leaving, he whispered, "Hey, June, if you don't like her, I do." June's eyes narrowed. "She works here." Minho raised a brow. That didn't sound like a no. June didn't answer. That night, he couldn't sleep. He thought about Christabel's laugh, her faith, her food, her quiet strength. And for the first time, he admitted it to himself. He liked her. He liked her more than he'd ever liked anyone. But he also felt scared. "She's a maid," he whispered into the dark. "I'm her boss. This is wrong." But his heart didn't care. The next day, he saw her sitting by the garden, reading her Bible under the shade of a tree. He walked over slowly. "May I sit?" he asked. She looked up, surprised. "Of course." He sat beside her, a little too close. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. "You're not just different," he said softly. "You're light. You walk like someone who knows her worth." She looked down shyly. "That's because I do." He nodded slowly. "Has anyone ever told you you're beautiful?" She looked up, startled. He smiled faintly. "My beauty." That's what I want to call you." She stared at him, unsure. He touched his chest lightly. "You don't know it yet, but I think my heart is learning to love again." For a moment, she said nothing. Then she smiled gently. "Love is patient, June?" He smiled back. "Then I'll wait." And in that moment, under the shade of the garden tree, two hearts began to heal. The weeks turned into months. June was no longer the cold man people feared. His laughter returned. His heart softened. And every part of his life began to bloom, like a dry land soaking in the first rain. But there was one thing that hadn't changed. Christabel. She was still devoted to her God, still woke early to pray, still smiled at everyone, still made food with love. And June? He had fallen deeply. One quiet evening, he asked her to walk with him in the garden, the same place where he first called her my beauty. She wore a soft yellow dress, the kind that made the wind dance around her. June was quiet at first. Then he stopped near a small cherry blossom tree. The petals were falling gently, like snow made of flowers. "I used to hate this tree," he said. "Why?" she asked softly. "Because it reminded me that nothing lasts forever, that even beauty falls." Christabel looked up at the blossoms. "Yes, but it also reminds us that beauty comes back." He smiled. "That's what you've been to me, Christabel. Beauty, coming back." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Her eyes widened. He opened it slowly. Inside was a silver ring, simple but shining, just like her. "I know this is not how fairy tales go," he said, voice trembling. "You're Nigerian. I'm Korean. You were my maid. I was your boss. But none of that matters to me anymore." Tears filled her eyes. "You brought light into my life when all I had was shadows," he whispered. "You taught me how to believe again. In God, in love, in myself." He went down on one knee. "My beauty, will you marry me?" For a moment, Christabel didn't speak. Her heart was full. Her hands shook. Then she nodded, eyes shining with tears. "Yes, June. Yes." He stood, and she wrapped her arms around him. The cherry blossoms swirled around them like tiny whispers of heaven. And in that garden, under a sky filled with falling petals, a cold heart finally found warmth. She leaned into him, smiled through her tears. Then he whispered to her, "You are indeed Christ's beauty." And they held each other, not as boss and maid, but as two hearts made whole. Please tell us what you learned from this story in the comment section. And if you found this story interesting, please like, share, comment, and subscribe for more captivating tales like this.